All right, so can I have that homework that's due? Currently set for the 26th, so that should be what, Monday, a week from today? Tentatively, the exam date was set to be next Friday. I thought I might not be here, but it looks like everything should be running smoothly, so we'll kind of keep that date as is. If something comes up this week where I know I'm not going to be here next week one day, we may push that forward to class, but as of right now, I don't expect that any longer. So we should be able to cover the rest of the material through this week and then on Monday. And then next Wednesday, I'll do some review in class. I've currently got some practice problems. If you go to files, practice problems, there's some older questions, some older material we covered. Some of the more recent stuff, I've got a second batch of questions, which I probably will put up this afternoon, but I'll probably replace it tomorrow. I haven't gotten time to add in some additional questions there as well. So I'll put up the original one, which I think has 15-ish questions. I'll probably throw another 5 or 6 questions in there and kind of re-upload it tomorrow, but I want to make sure that I kind of have those well written and make sure that it's kind of line up with what we cover in class. Okay. So you should see those pop up there as well. You'll have kind of 2 sets of problems that you can kind of look through. Okay. And those questions will be very similar to what you would see in the exam. So they'd be very good to look at leading into the exam. Okay. Any questions from me before we get started here today? Okay, we're at. All right, so we left off. We kind of finished talking about elasticities. We'll kind of switch gears here a little bit, and kind of, I think that had we're all able to relate to some other stuff we talked about. So this will relate to some other stuff we talked about, but it won't be relating to elasticities, which is looking at measures of surplus. So to start out, one term that we'll have that we want to know is allocative efficiency. So allocative efficiency just means that the resources in our economy are going to whom it would maximize utility for society, or that the way that resources are being allocated, would say another way of thinking about this is it limits what we end up calling deadweight loss, right? So it limits the amount of surplus that society loses. Okay? So what is surplus? Right? So we remember we said we can think of the demand curve reflects our marginal benefit, and the supply curve reflects marginal cost. So if we put those two things on the same graph, and I'll get out of the way here in a second. We said we knew that the equilibrium point would be where marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit. So the way that we're going to define surplus is really at whatever quantity we're looking at. Right, we're going to take the difference between the marginal benefit to society, which is how much that consumer is benefiting by consuming that first unit, and the difference between how much it costs producers to supply that first unit. So for the very first unit, kind of our surplus measure, which is just the marginal benefit minus the marginal cost, is going to be pretty large, right? And then as we see more and more units purchased, well, what happens? Well, as I produce more, we said marginal cost is increased, the marginal benefits to consumers decrease. You can kind of see here, our surplus is getting smaller and smaller, up to the point where at the very last quantity, or at our equilibrium quantity, when marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit, what would surplus value, what would surplus value be there? So at that equilibrium quantity, if surplus is just defined as marginal benefit minus marginal cost, 0, right? Because at the equilibrium point, we know marginal costs are equal to marginal benefits of that last unit supplied to the market and purchased on the market. So the allocated efficient point is going to be the quantity that would be our equilibrium quantity, or the price that would result in the equilibrium quantity is another way of saying it. So basically we want to get to this point. So I said allocated efficiency means that surplus, total surplus, is maximized for society. Okay? So you can think about surplus being a general measure of the benefits to society. The problem is consumers' benefits and producers' benefits vary, right? This was the idea that for producers, what was the marginal benefit? We said that was actually just the price they could sell the good for. And for consumers, well, that was actually their marginal cost, right? And so we have to find this delicate balance of where, we know that if we raise prices, that benefits producers, it will increase their surplus, but it hurts consumers, right? Higher prices will eat into consumer surplus. And we want to find the price that exactly kind of maximizes the sum of those two, right? So the sum of producer and consumer surplus, we'll think about that represents total surplus. So I don't know if I have that up here, but I can't remember if I have it in the next slide, but we can kind of think about here as total surplus. We're going to say that's consumer surplus and then added to producer surplus. Those are like the only two people in our economy. You're either a consumer or you're a producer of this good, or you're just not involved in the market at all. Okay. So we can think about how we break these down a little bit further. Okay. So if I wanted consumer surplus, well, the definition of surplus I've got over there is just the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. Now, the problem was, actually, I might need all three colors here, so let me just do the general form of the graph in black. So we've got quantity, price, we've got demand, which reflects marginal benefits, and we've got supply, which reflects marginal costs. So for society, I said, the overall surplus is going to be the difference between the marginal benefits of society and the marginal cost of society. But for consumers, well, their marginal benefit would still be this demand curve. But for them, let's assume, to make it easier starting out, that this market is currently in equilibrium. What is the marginal cost, right? So we're thinking about consumer surplus, I'll kind of just call this CS. Well, I want to take the consumer's marginal benefits and subtract the consumer's marginal cost. Well, what's the consumer's marginal cost? When you buy something, the additional cost to obtain one more unit would be its price, right? What does it cost the consumer to get one more unit of a good? Whatever that equilibrium price is. Okay? So we can kind of think about it here is, it's the difference between the marginal benefit and whatever this equilibrium price is. Well, what's the marginal benefit? We said the demand curve reflected that. So really you're thinking about for consumers, let's say for this first unit, the surplus to consumers will be, well, what was the marginal benefit of this first unit minus whatever the price was? And then for the next unit, what was that marginal benefit minus the price? And then if we want total consumer surplus, well, I take the surplus from the first unit, add to it the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, all the way up to whatever that last equilibrium unit of the market or that last equilibrium quantity. Okay? So consumer surplus will essentially just be another easy, less kind of technical description of it would be, it's the area between the demand curve and the price. It's the easiest way to think about it. Because it's, the reason why that works is because the demand curve reflects marginal benefits and the price reflects the marginal cost of consumers. But an easy way to think about it visually, it's just that area, that difference between my demand curve and the price. Okay? So I think I've got all this kind of up here. I jumped the gun, but I visually kind of got that difference between demand curve and price. The reason why is we can break it down. It's a difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. So the marginal cost of consumers is the price. Right. And so I don't think I've used this yet, but this is a summation sign in math. So it's just some mathematical notation. The easiest way to think about it is it says start at the very first unit sold, go to the very last unit sold. Right. So that Q is like Q star, right? Our equilibrium quantity. So look across every single unit or every single quantity, take the difference between marginal benefit and price, take the difference between marginal benefit and price. After you do that for every single quantity, add them all up. So I don't know, you've got probably I think you had to take brief calculus or whatever, I forget exactly the title of the course. But you know, you might have seen something like when we we're talking about derivatives, you know, you think about this as like rectangles underneath the line. It's that same sort of idea, right? We're going to calculate the surplus on every single quantity, add them all up. But what you're really doing is actually looking at the integrating the variables for don't have to, but if you don't want to. The math here is a lot easier. We don't have to deal with integration because we've got nice linear lines. We had some like quadratics and stuff, but then we might actually have to kind of break into our calculus. It might be like intermediate. We're not doing that. So I said here's a kind of easy way to remember it. Area below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. Any questions on that? So I wanted to calculate the consumer surplus here. Let's say I had this equilibrium price of $40. How could I calculate what the value of consumer surplus was in this market? Well, I know visually it'll be the area underneath my demand curve, but above that equilibrium price. So I've got the area visually here. What's the shape of this area? A triangle. I think this is a very probably why the hell are you asking that? But we have a triangle, right? So how do we find the area of a triangle? 1/2 times base times height. Where I guess it kind of depends on how you want to. I guess you could say 1/2 times length times width, height times width, whatever you want to say. I'll generally just reference it as base times height, right? What's the base of our triangle here? It goes from 0 to 50. What's the height? Well, it goes from 40 to 100. So that height would be 60. So 60 times 50. Do what? 3,000 there. And then I have to make sure I don't forget. Oh yeah, I'm looking at a triangle, so I need to multiply that area by 1/2. Right? So you know, I already forgot. I said 3,000 times 1/2 should have 1,500. Was it clear where I found that 60 and that 50 from? The base of my triangle, I was going from 0 to 50. And then for the height, well, it was starting at 100 and coming down to 40. So the difference between those two values, that was where I was getting that 60. Questions? How you calculate consumer surplus? Really just the area of a triangle. So if there's no questions. Let me see how closely you guys are actually kind of picking this up. So, so we've got a similar kind of setup, but this time the numbers vary a little bit. So here we've got an equilibrium price of 50. This kind of help you out with at least hard to visually see. If I'm thinking just about the equilibrium quantity, it's going to be at that unit quantity of 40. So equilibrium price is 50, the quantity that we're hitting that point, that price is 40. Talk to the people around you, we'll give you about a minute and a half here. Should be able to compute this consumer surplus pretty easily based off what we just did. So talk to people around you, work on this, and then we'll come together and talk about it.
If it's supporting, no, 2,000 divided by 1,000. Yeah.
I'm most likely to. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that. Isn't it 0 to? Says 0 to 50, 0 to 40.
So I said the equilibrium quantity is 40. So wanted to very small, or, yeah.
Let's do that.
Oh, yeah. Time here. All right. Good, no? You get to vote or no? No? Okay, talk to me after class and I'll. All right, so if you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess here. Make sure everyone gets an answer that's here. 37 of us here today. So. What did anybody get here? So how would you find that?
Base.
Yeah, we just did it over here. So what's the base of our triangle? It's going from 0. I even helped you if it was hard to see. Goes over to 40. So that base of our triangle is 40. What's the height of the triangle? Well, it's going from 100 to 50. 50 times 40 is what? 2,000. We then have to remember there's still one more step when counting the triangle, which is multiply it by half, or multiply it by 0.5. So if we do that, we should get 1,000. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving there? So there we go, 1,000. So I kind of talked through that, but maybe if you're wanting to write this down, what values am I using? Well, I said the base of that was 40. 100 minus 50 gave me that height of 50. And from there, it was a matter of getting that in my calculator. Okay. Any questions? We're going to keep moving. Okay with that for now? So let's think instead about producer surplus. All right. Once again, surplus is just producer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal costs, but not to consumers anymore, to producers, right? So what's the marginal benefit for producers? Said this a little bit earlier. I'm selling something. What's the additional benefit I get when I sell it? Yeah, just that price. Well, here, if we've got a market in equilibrium, then we know the price will be whatever that equilibrium price is. I'm then going to think about, so subtract the marginal cost. Well, we know what reflects marginal costs. The supply curve. So I can really think of this as the difference between, the difference between my supply curve and the equilibrium price. Well, this area would represent my producer surplus, right? When the producer of this good sells the first unit, it costs them however much, wherever point we're at in that supply curve. But the benefit they receive is this equilibrium price. So it's like for every unit, we're going to take producer surplus for every single unit and then add them all up, just like we did with consumer surplus. So now for producer surplus, when you think about it, it's a rectangle on the bottom part of the graph. That's another way you want to remember it. Consumer surplus is on the top, producer surplus is on the bottom, the way we're going to draw them. Okay? So if you think of it as we're just adding up from the first to the last unit sold, or from the first to the equilibrium quantity, the last unit sold, you're adding up the difference between price and marginal cost. Now in practice, you don't have to go through every single unit and calculate this, just like we do with consumer surplus, right? Really all I'm doing is finding the area of this rectangle. This triangle at the bottom, which, what did I want to say here? I'm going down. Oh, which another easy way to remember this is, just like I said, it's not the most technical way, but kind of like consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the area below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve, right? So it's the area below my equilibrium price and above my supply curve. Just like consumer surplus was the area above the equilibrium price, but below the demand curve. Okay. And that's because like benefits and costs are like flip-flop for producers and consumers. So I always thought this was like a fun way to remember producer and consumer surplus, right? So I paid 3,000, but I would have paid up to 4,000, consumer surplus of $1,000. And then I got 3,000, but I would have done it for 1,000. My producer surplus would be 2,000. We don't get the pun here pretty well, and go watch the movie. It's classic. Okay? But the idea is whatever you receive in terms of benefits minus whatever your costs were, that would be kind of the value of your surplus. Okay. So I'll kind of walk through this one. Shouldn't be too bad. If I actually want to calculate producer surplus, like I said, I don't have to go through every unit and calculate it and then add them all up. Because I can use a little bit of math to know that, well, it's really just the area underneath that line. Okay? So how can I find producer surplus here? I'm looking for the area of what? Again, not a trick question. Now that the triangle is just flipped upside down. Right? So I can still find the area using 1/2 times base times height. Here, what's the base of my triangle? Well, the equilibrium quantity is at 50 units, so 0 to 50 is my base, so 50 minus 0 is 50. What's the height of my triangle? I'm going from 70 to 20. The height of this triangle is also 50. 50 times 50, 2,500, divided by 2, 1,250. So all I was doing there was 1/2 times 50, which was the base, and then 50, which was also the height, just happened to work out in this example. And it's very similar to how we were computing consumer surplus. Okay. Any questions up to this point? Anything too crazy? I won't ask you guys to do this one, kind of work through it together. But let's say if I had a price of $80, equivalent price of 80, and the equivalent quantity is 60 here. How could I find my producer surplus here? So what's the base of that triangle? Going from 0 to 60. So if I really wanted to, I could write this out, although 60, if I subtract 0, I didn't think I can do that in my head to make life a little bit easier. What's the height of my triangle here? Yeah, I'm going from 20 to 80, so might be easier to do this math in my head as well. So 3,600 should be the answer, right? What did I forget? Yeah, to multiply it still by 1/2, right? So 60 times 60, 3,600. So what? 15 plus 3, so 1,800. Okay, I'm doing the math in my head correct, should be our producer surplus. Okay. So you got to see maybe exactly the question I'm starting to use in class, or using these formulas. Might be nice to have a calculator with you. You can pull up your phone calculator. It's never going to be anything too crazy. You shouldn't need like a TI 90, whatever they've got now. But just kind of some basic calculations, make sure you're not making a mental math mistake. All right. So that's the setup. Now it's more interesting. I should say interesting, more difficult problem. So we're going to talk about some things the government do. We've already talked a little bit about price caps or kind of price floors or price ceilings, right? So we'll talk a little bit more in depth about those, as well as quotas, taxes and subsidies, and think about how do these actions of the government impact total surplus in the market. So you can kind of think about here, I now know how to calculate producer surplus. I now know how to calculate consumer surplus. Kind of weird, but let's say I had this example. Keep this easy from the math in my head since we've already done a lot of this math. Let's say I have my demand curve starting at 100 here, my supply curve starting at 40, and the equilibrium quantity is 60. What would total surplus be? Notice total surplus would be the sum of consumer and producer surplus. So total surplus to society, adding up consumer and producer surplus, would be this entire area in between my demand and my supply. So total surplus is the area in between, right? When we think about surplus, to society being marginal benefit minus marginal cost. But for society overall, when I'm lumping consumers and producers together, that's just going to be the difference between my demand and supply curve. Okay? So once again, calculating this should be what we've been doing, because what's different than the other ones we've been calculating, but this is still a triangle. So I could just find total surplus by finding the area of this triangle, or I could break it down into components and then add them together, right? Find consumer, find producer surplus, and then add them together. I can do it either way. So we're going to want to think about now how we can calculate producer consumer surplus. We could then find total surplus, just adding those two together. How are these government actions going to limit total surplus? Because we know at that allocated efficient point, when the market's in equilibrium, we have maximized total surplus. So if we have an action that eats into or decreases the total surplus from this allocated efficient point, from that equilibrium point, we'll call that loss of surplus, the loss of surplus, dead weight loss. Okay? So this is going to be the total surplus that's lost because the government's done something to put this market not in perfect equilibrium. So we'll start, this is the general idea of where we're going. We'll start the discussion. We already looked a little bit at how taxes work, but we'll kind of hopefully, I think, have enough time. Where are we at in time? Oh yeah, we'll understand kind of the surplus impacts that taxes can have. So, you know, to be fair, I don't want to like hate on the government too much, but why do we pay taxes? Later on in this course, we actually get at some useful actions by the government. Probably early on in the course, I will tell you they're very inefficient, right? But things like public goods, right? No one person can afford to pay for the US military. But if you take a little bit from everyone, you can build up this massive military. That's the general idea. So hopefully, you know, they pay for other things like schools and roads. And driving around Muncie right now, I don't know where their taxes are going, but that's the idea. So we got income taxes, sales taxes. You know, we're not going to kind of hammer this too much. Probably got like a tax accounting class to really dive into some differences. But what we're going to try to understand are these excise taxes that are imposed on companies when they produce a good. Now they'll have very similar effects, and I don't think I'll be able to show you today, but maybe next class. That it doesn't matter if you put the tax on who's producing it or who's purchasing it, it has the same implications. But for now, we'll start out because I think it relates to things we've already talked about. We'll think about these excise taxes, which are they're taxes on a specific good and on the specific, or sorry, on the production of a specific good. So you can think about this as like if there's a tax on cigarettes, Marlboro's paying for that, right? And then they might pass that cost on to you, but they're initially going to be the ones paying for it. Okay? So we'll then get to something called tax incidence, which is, okay, once we put this tax on this good, we're going to see that it sometimes negatively impacts consumers more than it impacts the producers. And I'll be into that discussion, but it's going to be related to something we've already talked about, which is elasticity. You can kind of think about it this way. I'll jump the gun a little bit. If I impose a tax, what does that do to the price of a good generally? Goes up. We'll walk through why exactly. We've looked at it before. If consumers are very inelastic, so just think about smoking. People are very inelastic, right? They want to smoke a pack of cigarettes a day, no matter what. You really do. But right, producers are generally pretty elastic to price changes. Like they're very responsive in how much they're producing, given how much taxes influence the price. So if I put a tax on cigarettes, producers are elastic, consumers are inelastic. Who do you think is going to bear more of the burden of that tax? Remember, elasticity means responsiveness. So producers are very responsive to this change. Consumers aren't. So generally, if you're not responding to change and someone else is, you're going to lose out, right? So the consumers, if you're more inelastic, would bear more of the burden. Now, like I said, we'll dive deeper into that, but that kind of setting it up right now. So we'll think about kind of a base example just to show why taxes suck, and then we'll kind of break it down a little bit further, right? So let's say that we have this individual, and they would have paid $11,000 for a used car, right? They're I don't know, their car broke down, they've got some money saved up, they're trying to get a pretty decent used car. They're looking out there, and they would have paid $11,000 for whatever specific make and model they were looking There's another individual, Matt, who's has a car, has the make and model this person's willing to is willing to buy, and really, he'd be willing to sell it for $10,000. Well, if these two people meet, what's probably going to be the result? If David would pay up to 11,000, Matt's willing to give it up for 10. There's $1,000 of value in the middle there where they're both okay with that, right? If I chose 10,500 here, well, that's more than Matt. Matt would have sold it for 10,000. Of course, he'll sell it for 10,500. David would have paid 11,000. Of course, he'll pay 10,500 for it. So we have this range in the middle where you might see they can come to an agreement and a transaction occurs. But now let's think about it. There's a 15% tax on used car sales, right? Which there are taxes on used car sales, which just blows my mind as well, right? You already taxed it once, and you taxed it. But anyway, when you think about now, let's say that David actually paid 10,000. So at $10,000, Matt is completely indifferent. Like he's willing to take 10,000, but he would have liked to take more. But yeah, he's okay taking 10,000. So the transaction could have occurred if David would have offered him 10,000. But the problem is, if David now has to pay this additional sales tax, right? I think I'm missing a number there, right? 15% should be 1,100, 500. Hang on. I messed up. It should be this, right? There we go. Now my math, I think, works out. So if he pays 15% sales tax on 10,000, that's $1,500. That makes a little bit more sense, right? So the point is still made, regardless of what that number was, because at this new price, right? If David willing to pay 11,500 for this car, he was only willing to pay up to 11,000. This transaction doesn't occur, right? So essentially, this is a very easy example on an individual basis to show how taxes are going to decrease the equilibrium quantity on the market. This would have been a transaction that occurred, a used car that was produced or consumed on the market that no longer is. Okay. So what does this look like in more kind of graphical terms? So I think I've got this in the slides, but I think I can do a better job maybe of walking through this a little bit and relating this to some things that we've talked about already. So also this eraser is not doing the best today, so I try to use blue to make this stand out a little bit more. So let's say we've got market, and it's currently I'll try to do two things at once. So if this market is currently in equilibrium, so we'll kind of call this, actually let's call this QB, and actually I should write the whole word out, right? This is the quantity and the price before the tax, right? What would total surplus be here? Well, consumer surplus is what? The area below my demand curve, but above that equilibrium price. Producer surplus was the area below that equilibrium price, but above my supply curve. So when you think about this shaded blue area here, that represents my total surplus before the tax. Okay. So total surplus before the tax. And if it helps, if you don't have colors, one of those taking notes here, you could just draw these as vertical lines and then think about here that your little box would just be the vertical lines. If the government comes in and imposes a tax in this market, we talked about this before, what's going to shift? If the producers have to pay this additional tax when creating this good, so we see this a lot with like pollution taxes, I've essentially done what that producer's costs. Have increased their input costs, right? They now have to spend more money to produce the same amount of units. So what does that mean? To produce the same amount of units that they were before, their marginal cost will now be whatever they were before, plus the additional tax they have to pay. And that's going to be true at every single quantity. So we kind of get this leftward shift in our supply curve or a decrease in supply. Okay. So if it helps, you think about this as supply after the tax, and this was supply before the tax. Okay. So what's my new equilibrium price and quantity? Well, where's my new supply curve at demand? So here's kind of my new equilibrium quantity after the tax. And the price, for now, we can think about it as that new equilibrium price is going to be wherever we're at and where that new supply curve hits our demand. So what is my new total surplus? Well, it gets a little bit confusing. We can break it down in components, but for right now, I think about just total surplus. Here's my new quantity. So my total surplus will just be the difference between my demand curve and my supply curve, right, at every single quantity. So I'm drawing these horizontal just to represent this is, you don't have colors. After the tax, surplus was horizontal. Before the tax, it was this vertical area. Well, notice total surplus now, the difference between demand and the supply curve, right? So even though there's this new supply curve, right, the old supply curve still is what it is. It's just there's additional tax. Right? So I'll break this down in a second and show you why it still goes all the way down to that original supply curve. So total surplus is going to be the difference between our demand and our supply curve, but only up to that new equilibrium quantity. So this area right here, color, will be what we call deadweight loss, right? Total surplus before was this huge blue area. It's now just the red area. The difference between the two, that will be what I lost out on. Okay. And why did I lose out on that surplus? Because after the tax, I'm no longer selling any of these units. So what was the surplus I was getting before from those units? Total surplus was the difference between supply and demand curve for every single one of those units. Okay. So this shift in supply, right? And got it here. Before we had consumer producing surplus, I could break. I was just doing total surplus up here. I could actually break that down a step further and producer and consumer surplus. And then impose this tax. Let's just keep it $1. So it shifts my supply curve. Right? I kind of have a situation here where my new equilibrium price after the tax will say is $4.50. Well, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Because the price that consumers pay and the price that sellers get to keep are not the same. So let's say we see this shift in supply and it raised the price from $4 to $4.50 for consumers, right? When they buy this good. But when I pay the company $4.50, how much of that do they actually have to pay to the government? Whatever the value of the tax was, right? So they're really only keeping whatever you pay them minus the value of the tax. Or think about it this way. When you're paying them this price, they only got to keep, so you're thinking of the price that producers or sellers get to keep, right? So price that consumers pay, the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the tax is just the value of the tax. Right? Because whatever my costs were before, how much higher are they? Whatever the value of that tax is. So at every single point, the firm's marginal cost will be whatever they were before, plus an additional $1 of tax. So the difference between our lines here is just going to be the value of the tax. And our new equilibrium price will represent how much the consumers are going to pay, but the sellers only get to keep wherever they're at on their original supply curve, right? Or the amount that consumers pay minus the value of that tax. So it might be a little bit abstract for right now. Get some different ways of thinking about it. But the general idea is going to be that this tax will shift the supply curve, result in this new equilibrium price. So if it helps, you can think about the equilibrium price being like the sticker price you would see if you go to buy the good. That's what consumers are going to have to pay. So when the consumers give $5 to the producer, well, they've already spent the $1 tax to produce that good. So if you, I think I'm mixing up with those. So I said, here, we'll stick with these numbers. Let's say the sticker price is $4.50. Consumer hands that over to, whatever good this is, to whoever selling the cigarette. So whoever was selling those cigarettes keeps that $4.50, but they've already spent $1 just to produce that good. So they're really only getting $3.50. So that's why the difference between what the consumers pay, and we say it's what the sellers keep, but ultimately it's like the net benefit to the producer, right? They sold it to the consumer for $4.50, but they have to net out that, but $1 of that I already spent on taxes. I had like $0 before I sold it, and so I was actually -1. Then I added $4.50 to it. That makes some more sense. Yeah.
Question that I have is, could you figure out the tax using that same 1/2 base times pi formula? The little circle of tax that you have right here?
The deadweight loss?
Yeah.
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 Yep. So what would deadweight loss be here? If I said it was all this surplus loss from these units that I'm no longer selling, well, I've got a triangle. So the base of my triangle is what? 250. What's the height of my triangle? Well, notice the height of the triangle is actually just the value of the tax. Because the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the tax is just the additional tax. So I take that $1 tax, or the height, times the base, 250. So one more thing to do because it's still a triangle. So 250 times 1/2, giving me 125. Yeah, they're kind of jumping the gun there, but that's a good way, we're starting to kind of think about this today. So before I kind of go forward, any questions here? Just want some, you want me to reaffirm something or kind of say it again or kind of just a general question? So it's getting tough because we have the supply curve shift that we talked about already, but now we're starting to get a situation where the price we see in the market is different from the actual value that the producers are going to benefit from. So now if we think about this as, now I'll break it down, this one down on the slide, but I think I'll write down some stuff to accompany it that I don't think are on the slides that might be helpful. So if I want to think about here, after the tax, where is my consumer surplus? Well, surplus is always marginal benefit minus marginal cost. But for consumers, we said the demand curve reflects marginal cost. And we were using the demand reflects marginal benefits. And for marginal cost, what we were using was the equilibrium price. But now, because we have a difference in the price consumers pay and how much the sellers keep, we'll kind of maybe notate this a little bit different and kind of say, like, this is the price that the consumers are going to be paying. And then for producers, what are their marginal benefits and their marginal costs? Well, their marginal costs are reflected in the supply curve. Excuse me. And their marginal benefit, well, it's not going to be the price consumers pay. You kind of think about it, it's the price that the producers get to keep, right? Or another way of saying that is, so I'll shorthand this one a little bit. The price that the producers kind of keep, or like their net marginal benefit, is going to be whatever the consumers pay minus the value of that tax. So when I say the price that sellers keep, we're really thinking about what's the total marginal benefit for selling this good. Well, it's however much they sold it for minus that tax that they had to pay to produce. So what does this look like visually? If I've got consumer surplus, this is just the area in between my demand curve and my new equilibrium price that consumers are paying. So consumer surplus is still going to be that rectangle on top. It's just now it kind of goes down only to that price consumers pay. And notice the quantity has dropped from what the previous equilibrium was. I can then think about producer surplus. Well, that's going to be the area between the price that they get to keep, which we said the difference between the price consumers pay and the price that sellers keep is just the value of the tax, or the difference between that supply curve without and the supply curve with the tax. So the area underneath that price, but above my supply curve. But it's still going to be on the lower triangle. It's going to be a little bit smaller than it was before. kind of this is a, remember that kind of blue shaded area represented what total surplus was before the tax, like this huge triangle. I would be kind of going from here all the way up to there. So the area in between is what gets a little tricky. So if I've got consumer and I've got producer surplus, why is this counted as total surplus? Well, that area in between the two actually represents something that is pretty intuitive. Who else benefits other than producers and consumers when a good is taxed? Government, right? So how much surplus does the government now get? You could almost think about it as like a government surplus, right? This one's really easy. It's just going to be the new equilibrium quantity after the tax. So however many units are sold times the value of the tax, right? If I'm taxing every unit $1, well, if I sell 1,000 units, that's $1,000 that's going to the government. If I tax it $5 and I sell 1,000, that's $5,000 going to the government. What does this represent visually? Well, remember the difference between the price that sellers keep and that consumers pay, that which is the value of the tax. What would the, I guess we're thinking about this as a rectangle, that's the height of my rectangle, what's the width of it? Whatever my new equilibrium quantity is. Yeah, so that rectangle really just represents government surplus or tax revenue. So that's still surplus to society, right? Consumers and producers are hurt, but some of what was producer and consumer surplus now goes to the government. So we now have three parties, so now you get total surplus, and we have to add up consumer, producer, and government. But that still leaves us with all these units not being sold and all of that surplus being lost, or what we would call a deadweight loss, that red area. All right, so we'll pick up on this next class. We'll walk through kind of some different ways of thinking about how surplus is changing hands, and then we'll relate it to elasticity and talk about tax incidents. Okay. All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.